Okay, so this is kind of categorized sometimes as a subset of sculpture. I sort of think of it as its own thing, but we're going to talk about it in relation to sculpture in the same module for this class. And installation art is something that's a little bit tricky in terms of how I approach things in this class, because generally in these lectures I've gone through something like painting and then the different techniques and materials associated with it, like oil and watercolor and acrylic. And for installation art, that isn't really a thing, because installation work can be made out of anything, including sound, including video, including the absence of things. So it's a little bit more, it tends to be more conceptual. It isn't always more conceptual, but it tends to be more conceptual. So it's a little bit harder to talk about in those kind of neat categories like we've done so far. So mostly we're just going to look at examples of it. So here's a really, really pared down basic definition of what installation art is. Installation art are spaces conceived of as works of art for viewers to enter and experience. And that is almost always true of installation art, is that you can go into it or under it or through it. It's generally immersive, and it generally requires some kind of experiential thing for the work to be complete. So you have to interact with it in some way, usually, even if that's just walking through it, for the concept to be realized and for the work to be complete. So in that way, not only is it related to sculpture, it's also related to performance art, which is something we don't really go into in this class, but take art history 2. We talk about performance art there quite a bit. So, okay, installation art is one of those things that is a little bit hard to define. This is as good a definition as any that I've found. And it's easier just to look at lots of examples of it and kind of figure it out by seeing it and experiencing it. So we're going to look at a couple of pieces by Bruce Nauman. Bruce Nauman is most famously a performance artist, but he is also, in my mind, one of the earliest creators of installation art. And that's this piece called Green Light Corridor, which he created in 1970. And the idea was just a narrow corridor, a narrow hallway, that people entered on one end and had to walk through to the other end. And it was just this very narrow, very kind of strangely lit, bright green lit space that people had to walk through. And so that was the art. The art was created by making this narrow space and lighting it in a certain way, and then the experience of walking through it and the kind of feeling of discomfort that that created. And that was the artwork. So this is kind of a groundbreaking idea. And this didn't just come out of nowhere. There are lots of precedents to installation art that contribute to its development, and I'm not going to go into every single one of them, but I'm going to give you kind of a crash course in things that led up to the development of installation art. So the Surrealists, who, again, and if you take art history, you'll learn all about the Surrealists. The Surrealists, which is kind of an early 20th century movement, though there are still artists working today who identify as Surrealists. They sometimes exhibited their paintings in galleries decorated to look like a Surrealist painting come to life. So that is kind of an installation where you're walking into a gallery and it looks like the painting that you're looking at. That's an installation. Around those kind of parameters, Peggy Guggenheim, who's was a famous art collector, had a gallery in New York that was set up and designed to be a kind of experiential gallery where the gallery and furniture itself were sort of part of the exhibit. So that was kind of installation art. Alan Capro created places he called environments, which were rooms that viewers entered and explored. This is an image of one of Alan Capro's pieces called Yard, which he made in 1967, where you're supposed to go in and climb through all these tires. So that's kind of an installation art, this idea of environments. It was during post-minimalism that the practice of creating spaces became more widespread, and the word installation actually becomes the standard description of these things. There were also things called happenings that are a kind of performance art that often involved participation from the viewer, and those are kind of a precedent for installation art. So there's lots of things that kind of lead into this idea. But now we're just going to look at a bunch of examples of things. So on the left, we have Tadashi Kawamata, and this is a sculpture called Chairs that has been listed as a sculpture and as an installation. I think it can be categorized either way. You can walk around it, so it's a freestanding sculpture, but it has more of a presence maybe where it feels like it's a built thing that feels a little bit more like an environment. I still feel like it's more of a sculpture than an installation. In contrast to on the right, we have Chiharu Shiota, who's a contemporary installation artist, sculptor, and fiber artist. And this is one of her works called In Silence. So they both utilize chairs, and one of the main differences is in hers, you walk into this created environment and walk around inside of it, whereas with Kawamata, you're walking around the outside and you're observing it from the outside rather than going through it, okay? Let's look at a couple more examples. So we have on the left, this is Gabriel Daw. This is Plexus number 19. You can see a Gabriel Daw installation or sculpture similar to this at Crystal Bridges in Bentonville, Arkansas. It's kind of easy to miss. It's as you're going down the stairs. It's up on the ceiling. So this is a string art piece. Okay, so it comes from the ceiling and connects down to the base of the wall. So it gets categorized as an installation a lot, mostly because it's engaging with the wall, but it also comes out into space, right? But it's not really a relief sculpture. So a lot of times we see the word installation applied to things that people don't know what else to call, quite frankly. So this is one of those instances where I would say this is more what I would categorize as soft sculpture or fiber art. But it sometimes, Gabriel Daw gets kind of labeled an installation artist, which also kind of applies. On the right, we have Alex Chinek. So this is From the Knees of My Nose to the Belly of My Toes. And this is essentially, they've taken the side of this building, removed it, and then reconstructed it to look like it slipped off the side of the building. So again, in my mind, this is a little bit more of a sculpture because it's not something you're really going in or experiencing or an environment. It's more just something you'd walk up to and look at. But the reason I think people kind of consider this to be an installation work is because it's site-specific, right? So it's made in a place outside a gallery, outside a museum, specific to that one site. So that is another kind of piece of the puzzle that is installation art. So sometimes when you see site-specific work like this, it just sort of automatically gets categorized as installation. This is one of my favorite sculptures that I also do kind of view as an installation. This is a piece by Bruce Nauman. Bruce Nauman, who we looked at his Green Corridor earlier. He's most famous as a performance artist and a video artist, but this is a piece that he conceptualized and had the idea for in 1977 for the first sculpture project Münster, which is in Münster, Germany, and it's every 20 years or 30 years, something like this. It's or I think it's every 10 years. And the first one was in 1977, and it's artists from all over the world come together and make sculptures on site in this little town in Germany. It's pretty rad. And so this is a really simple concept, but it's basically an inverted pyramid. So you walk up to it, and it deceptively looks like a flat square with lines. And then as you get closer, you see that it goes quite a bit inward. It depresses in. So here's one of my images I took of it when I was in Germany a few years ago. And then just to give you the perspective of how deep of a grade this is, here are myself and two of my friends, two of my graduate work classmates we were over there studying, sitting in the groove of this thing. And you can see here we all are. So it's kind of neat because it's this experiential sort of piece that you don't really realize what's going on until you get into it and walk up and down it. Here's my favorite installation artist, Yayoi Kusama. I wrote papers on her as an undergrad, and she was sort of not as known. She's having a moment in the last few years. You've maybe even heard of her or seen her work before. Yayoi Kusama is a contemporary Japanese artist. She is still living. She's still kicking it. She's in her 90s, still making art. And she's quite famous now. So she really, in terms of what we really mean when we say installation art, she's the name I think of, and she was kind of the first person to really do it. So she should really be credited with the conceptualization and the creation of installation art as it's known today. And she started this back in the 60s. She's Japanese. She moved to America, initially Seattle and then New York in the late 50s. And she came up with a lot of really fantastic work that was copied by white male peers, and she didn't get credit for it, which is the story of lots of women in art history. But what I want to show you today are the things she's most famous for, which are her infinity rooms. So this is one of her infinity rooms, and what these are small rooms with mirrors on all the walls, on the ceiling, and on the floor. So that as a viewer, when you go to a museum, you have to sign up for a time slot, and then you walk into one of these things and they close the door, which is also mirrored, and then you are inside this thing. So this is me taking a picture of myself inside the one that is at the Broad in Los Angeles. And it's very disorienting because you feel like you're sort of out floating in space or something. They're really, really cool, really exceptional works. And she's done, I think to date, about 27 of these, and they tour around the world from time to time. So if you ever have the chance to experience a Yayoi Kusama infinity room, check them out. Here she is in one of her first, I think this is her very first infinity room that she made in the mid-60s in New York. And this is also, she incorporates soft sculpture as well. She was one of the earliest soft sculpture artists. This is an installation of hers that travels, and when you first go into it, everything is completely white. And as viewers in the audience walk in, there's a gallery attendant who hands you a little card with stickers on it. And then you get to place your stickers. And the only rule is you can't take the stickers out. You have to place all your stickers. And so then by the end of the exhibition, the previously white room is totally covered in these dots. But it's the participation of the audience that completes the work. So again, this is another one of these that was in Los Angeles. This is me and two of my friends in grad school inside one of these. Here's another one. Polka dots are a big theme in her work. She is schizophrenic and has hallucinations where she sees the world covered in polka dots. So she recreates that kind of imagery in a lot of her work. This is one of her more famous ones. She also does a lot of work with pumpkins. Pumpkins and polka dots are two of her big things, and then infinity rooms. So this one is all three. Here's a couple more. I just love her, so there's a lot of her works in here, and they're pretty fantastic. Okay, this is another contemporary artist who's really fascinating. His name is Thomas Saraceno, and this is his work In Orbit, which I was able to experience in Germany at Museum 21. And so what it is you go in, and it's many stories up inside this really grand museum, and you get to walk out onto this metal net, basically, and climb around on it. And there's multiple layers of it. And I thought I'd have no problem with this and would just walk right out there. And I got out there and absolutely froze. And I don't usually have a problem with heights, but my friend had to like crawl out and get me because it was very disorienting and kind of a terrifying experience. But it's super cool, and it's a very interesting idea. And it's another one of these installation works where really the experience of it and the feelings of it and the uncertainty of it are part of what completes the artwork. So here's a couple more views of this one. He also does sculptures where he has these enclosed glass boxes with different kinds of spiders in them, and he rotates the boxes. He puts them in dark rooms where they're only lit from one direction and rotates the boxes every so ever many hours, so the spider's webs change, and so the creation of the web within the box is then what he considers the sculpture, which is kind of an installation for the spider. This is another one of his pieces. So this was on the ground, so you weren't up in the air, but you could still climb around inside it. It was at the MoMA in New York. This is another artist. This is Pipoloti Rist. So she is a video installation artist. So she creates all different kinds of work, but it usually involves video. And her most famous works are things like this. This is Pixelwald, which means pixel forest. And you just go into the room And there's video on all sides, and there's these soft things that you're supposed to lay down on to experience it. And so it's this sort of immersive video kind of environment. It's just another shot of that work by Piccolotti Wrist. Gregor Schneider, he's a German artist who does extremely disorienting installations. You go into these, they're usually tucked back in a weird part of a museum where you feel like you're going somewhere you're not supposed to. This is his one that you can see from the outside, so I chose it, but it's very atypical. Usually there's a weird little kind of not very well marked door. And then you walk into these things and it's pitch black, you can't see anything, and you have to feel around the walls, and they're usually stretchy fabric, and you feel like maybe you're going to get stuck or you're pushing into some kind of weird enclosure. And then you'll open a door and it'll be like a perfectly white room that looks like a kitchen from the 1950s. And then you'll walk out and you'll be in another like pitch black hallway. So basically, his work are installations that mess with your senses. Okay, so they take away your vision, so you have to feel, and they play on kind of stressful emotions. And so he's doing these very sensory experimentation kind of installation works. It's James Tyrell. This is one of my other very favorite artists. So he is an artist who works with light, and he creates these installations that are light sculptures. So sometimes they involve natural light, oftentimes it's LED light, sometimes it's neon, but sometimes they'll be standalone, just kind of in the corner of a museum, but other ones you walk into these spaces and they're quite disorienting. It's hard to tell where you are, how far back the room goes and how far you can walk, and sometimes they gradually are moving you upward or downward and you don't quite know what's going on. He also does some work with sensory deprivation, but he's most famous for his installation work. This is an image of his sculpture that is his installation that is at Crystal Bridges in Bentonville, Arkansas, which is just an hour and a half south of here. If you go, try to get there at sunset if you want to experience this, or where your stay will overlap with sunset, because if you go into this at sunset, it puts on this whole like light show. It's very cool. Here's one of his installations that was at the Guggenheim in New York. This is one of his pieces from Mass Mocha, and that's in Massachusetts. I have been in this piece. They have one of the largest Tyrell collections in the world, and it's another one that's like surprisingly disorienting. His works are very hard to photograph because they just kind of look like light, but when you're there with them, it's really an interesting experience. Here's the outside of one of his installations. Okay, and then at the end, I just want to go through, so those are just some examples of different kinds of installation art. And then I just want to go through some words that are kind of affiliated and related to installation art. So process art, art in which the process of making it, or the interaction, or the process of experience completes the work, where it's not so much about the end result as it is about the experience and the process. That's something we affiliate with installation work. Body art, work that relies on the human body as like sort of the site for the work, is often called installation art. That also really ties in with performance art a little bit more, and performance art is the next word. Site specific, something that's made for a specific location, is often categorized, rather than just being sculpture, as installation art. Land art, so something that manipulates the land on which it is made, like this piece, Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson, which is quite famous. It's in Utah near the Great Salt Lake. Land art is what I just talked about. And then ideas of conceptual art. So things where, like the Gregor Schneider with the sensory deprivation, where you're experiencing something without one of your senses, that kind of idea of conceptual art, are also related to installation art. So that's kind of just a glimpse of what installation art is. There are lots of things that can be categorized as installation art. It's a term that's a little bit overused, in my opinion, now. A lot of things aren't really installations. They're just sculptures that someone is adding this word to. But it's a good word to know, especially if you're going to go to museums and galleries. Okay.